Welcome to My Therapist Says. During today's broadcast, I'll be your host and moderator as we present Building Relationships with Our Children to Last a Lifetime. Dr. Joe Price, an exceptional parent, San Diego State University professor, and researcher is today's presenter. Dr. Price is a distinguished developmental scientist and professor in the Department of Psychology at San Diego State University and a member of the Joint Doctoral Training Program in Clinical Psychology at San Diego State University and the University of California, San Diego. He is also a research scientist at the Child and Adolescent Services Research Center at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. Dr. Price's recent research and publications focus on the developmental sequel of the experiences associated with early maltreatment and the implementation of evidence-based interventions for child behavior problems in the child welfare systems of care. Today's event takes place before a live audience and live streaming while offering practical biblical solutions. It's like having your own Christian doctor within the comforts of your living room. I hope you will sit back, relax, and take in these life-changing insights. Please join me as we connect with a live audience and My Therapist Says. Welcome to My Therapist Says, and we want to just welcome Dr. Joe Price. I really appreciate you being here. Dr. Price is willing to come. We're able to get him at least once per year, and it's a privilege and an honor to have you on the platform. I really do believe. I've shared this before, but I want to share this again, that my lovely wife, Robin, and I so deeply appreciate Dr. Joe Price and Pastor Sherry Price. They're married, and that Robin and I, my wife, we have sought out their expert advice on parenting because they have done this very well with their children and their family. And we just really appreciate and admire your skills, not only as a professional, but someone who loves Jesus and has a way of really modeling this healthy relationship with family members. So I just wanted to say this is a couple we have sought out, my wife and I have, to gain insight into how to manage family and how to become better parents and continue to do so as we go through these seasons of life. So I wanted to thank Pastor Sherry Price is here in the auditorium, and also wanted to thank Dr. Joe Price for your leadership in my own family's life. So thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Good to see you. As opposed to being home watching Law and Order or something like that tonight. Sherry is my wife, Pastor Sherry. She is on staff here at Skyline for women's ministry and local serve. Sherry and I have 3 daughters. They are 25, 27, and 29 years old. They're all married, and we have 2 granddaughters. So we've been through the parenting part before, and it's part of our life experience. Some of our experiences I'll share with you tonight, but I also want to share with you some of the research in terms of family relationships. Sherry and I do a parenting class on Wednesday nights here at Skyline. And one of the first questions we ask when we look at parenting goals is we ask the question, what kind of relationship do you want to have with your children when they're adults? We often think about parenting goals in terms of accomplishing, helping them to learn academics and good social skills and come to know the Lord and spiritual development, and have all kinds of ideas in terms of what we want to accomplish as parents. But oftentimes we don't think about that one question. What kind of relationship do we want to have with our kids when they're adults? Now, some of you may have adult children, and the question is, what kind of relationship do you want to have with them now? And there's some things that we can do as parents to cultivate a lifelong relationship with our kids. And if we think of parenting rather than being just providers, and think of parenting as relationship building, it changes parenting. It changes how we look at parenting and how we approach parenting. Another question that we may want to ask ourselves is, what kind of relationship do we want our children to have with their children when they're adults? What it tells us by asking that question is that we're modeling for our kids how to have a relationship with them. We're modeling for our kids how to move on to the next generation and how to raise their kids. And so you and I, and not only helping to bring God's kingdom now into our families, we're helping them to learn how to do that within their families as well. So our work is generational. It's not just with our children, it's with subsequent generations as well. So let's talk about long-term relationships. It's a cultivating process. It's something that is also cumulative. So relationships with our kids are cumulative over time. Loving, positive relationships at one stage provides the foundation for the next stage in terms of loving, warm, caring relationships. So establishing that warm, close bond with an infant is going to set us up for that kind of relationship in childhood, and then in adolescence, and then in adulthood. And it's this cumulative process that goes along. Also, unresolved hurt, pain, tension in one stage makes it difficult to establish a positive relationship in the next. That's that cumulative process again. And it could be that we need to redirect or change what we're doing as parents at one stage. It could be that we have to involve ourselves in reconciliation and forgiveness that may be required before a positive relationship can occur with our kids. Again, it's this cumulative process. If we look at one of the verses I gave you, Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another. We often read that and think about he's talking about the church, but it means anybody. Think about the family, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you. If we take this long-term look at our relationships with our kids and say, what I do now is going to build for the next stage. The kind of relationship I have today, whether my kids are infants, like you folks in the back, they're children, they're adolescents or adults, that my relationship right now is going to affect my relationship in the future. So what I do today is going to matter. What I do today is going to have an impact on that relationship. And we should always be thinking ahead of ourselves and thinking, what kind of relationship do I want to have with my kids? Do I want to have with them in the future? There's something that it's important for us as parents to remember in this process, though. You and I as parents have more of an emotional investment in the parent-child relationship than our kids do. We bring them into the world. We have this special emotional attachment. We want them to be successful. We want them to grow. We want them to develop. They come into the world and it's like, whoa, who are you? And are you going to take care of me? Okay? And it's a natural process. God made it that way. If our children had the same kind of emotional investment, they'd never leave home. They'd be like, this is a good gig, Mom, Dad. I don't need anybody else. I don't need to get married and have my own family. I'm just going to stay here. And the human race would die off. God knew that we needed that kind of motivation to keep moving on generation to generation. So us as parents are always going to have more of an emotional investment in that relationship, which means that you and I may have to be very intentional as our kids get older in maintaining that relationship, especially as they move into new relationships and into their family. Because what happens when they have kids, their emotional investment is going to be towards their children. Okay? So we may have to be intentional. And we also may have to be very keen and aware of the boundaries of our relationship and aware of the fact that we're more emotionally invested than they are. And be aware of those boundaries that goes along with that. Tensions and conflicts can and do arise, but these challenges can be overcome if we do certain things. There's 3 components that I think are critical to long-term relationships in the family, and that's what I want to talk about in these next few minutes. So if you turn to your outline, what makes relationships last? There's 3 components that make relationships last. And Jesus knew about these. He used them in his relationships. The first one is demonstrating unconditional love. Listen to what Romans chapter 5, verse 6 and 8 says. You see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, but for a good person, someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrated his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's unconditional love. Our kids are not going to be perfect. They're not always going to do what we want them to do. They're not always going to obey us. God knows that. God understands that. But he has this unconditional love that he can give us towards our children as well. Look at verse 10, or listen to verse 10. For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? We worship a God who has unconditional love towards us. God knows that for our relationship with him to grow and to be established, he had to unconditionally love us first. He started a whole thing and says, I love you. I love you unconditionally. And I'm going to prove it. And he proved it on the cross. So that every time we see the cross, we're reminded of God's unconditional love. Our children need to look at us and be reminded of our unconditional love. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes of how we do that very practically. Second thing is maintenance of appropriate relationship boundaries. You and I need to maintain the role of being a parent. At some point, when our kids become adults, we may find some transition into friendship and elements of that. With my oldest daughter, Kelsey, she's almost 30 years old. There are elements of that friendship developing now. Sherry probably experiences that as well. But when I see her and I hug her, it is still that little girl with her dad. And that hug tells me, don't ever quit being my dad. I need you at age 30 to be my dad. Sometimes as parents, what happens is our kids enter into middle school and adolescence and they start having friendships, close bonds and friendships with their peers. We start to get jealous. And we start to feel like, oh no, I'm losing them. And sometimes we start to move out of our parental role and try to be friends with our kids. I've seen parents start dressing like they're adolescents, mothers and fathers, trying to get in on the gossip of what's going on in the peer group. Our kids need us to be parents, especially in adolescence, in middle school, in high school. Their brains haven't fully developed yet, especially the frontal cortex that gives them the ability to think about consequences and long-term consequences. That doesn't fully develop until age 24, 25. They need us to be their frontal cortex for them for a while in terms of thinking about consequences. So we need to maintain those boundaries. And then lastly, we need to engage in relationship cultivating experiences. Doing things with our family members that are going to develop relationships. Activities that build bonds within our relationship. And they're things that we can do developmentally, all through our kids' lives to do that. And we'll talk about that practically. Jesus did these things. He demonstrated unconditional love towards his disciples. He maintained boundaries. If you look at the scriptures, you can do this later. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, who am I? And Peter says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, you got that right. God revealed it to you. That's who I am. He later says to the disciples in John 15, you're no longer servants, you're friends. Because what I've learned from the Father, I'm now sharing with you. So now the relationship quality is kind of changed. There's more intimacy. But then later in that same evening, or later on after Jesus is resurrected, and Thomas goes, I'm not sure I believe Jesus is resurrected. And Jesus shows up and Jesus says, here, touch me. And Thomas touches Jesus and feels where he has been stabbed in the side, and he says, my Lord and my God. Jesus didn't stop him and say, oh, Thomas, we're buddies, remember? So, it's okay. You don't need to do Lord God thing. He says, Thomas, you believe because you saw me. Blessed are those who believe that I am Lord and God and didn't see me. In other words, he affirmed Thomas's statement. God maintains his boundaries with us. He allows us to have intimacy, but he maintains his boundaries. Maintaining those boundaries in relationships brings a sense of security to our kids. They know we are there. They know they can rely on us. And the other thing Jesus did is he had relationship cultivating experiences. He starts walking on the water towards the disciples. They're in a boat. And they're scared. And Jesus goes, don't be afraid. And Peter goes, well, if it's you, have me come out, Lord. Peter goes, all right, Peter, come on out. This is one of those relationship cultivating experiences. Peter gets out and starts walking on the water. Takes his eyes off Jesus, almost drowns. Jesus pulls him up. Peter never forgot that. After Peter announces that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus takes him and John and James up to the Mount of Transfiguration, where they see Moses and Elijah. That's a relationship cultivating experience that Peter never forgot. So Jesus did these things in his relationships. So let's get a little more specific. Let's look at our relationships. How do we demonstrate unconditional love with our kids? Well, if they're infants, take care of them. Be responsive to their needs. Be responsive to their cries. Be responsive to their hunger. Be responsive to any kind of fussing. You cannot spoil a baby, all right? You can spoil a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, but you can't spoil a baby. The more responsive you are with an infant, it builds that sense of trust. It says to them, I am loved. I am worth being taken care of in this relationship. Respond to their attempts to communicate. Provide nurturing physical contact, holding them, cuddling them. That says, I love you unconditionally. In childhood, being available when they're anxious, when they're fearful. Whatever that is, kids go through anxieties and fears as they're in early childhood and childhood. We're there. Providing encouragement as children learn new competencies and skills. Communicating love and acceptance when they have shortcomings and failings, which they're going to have when they start school, when they enter their peer group and making comparisons. And we're there to say, I love you. No matter what happens, I'm there to love you and care for you. And expressing love and acceptance after discipline. We still love you. I had to put you in timeout. I had to spank you. I had to take away a privilege. But I still love you. I still care for you. So we express that unconditional love. In adolescence, we're there for our adolescents during times of frustration and challenges in their lives. Active listening. We sit down and really listen to our adolescents and what they're saying. And they know that we're listening to them. Continuing to be there during mood swings, after discipline, that during adolescence we continually communicate to them, I'm here, I'm available to you. I may need to correct you, but I'm still here. And so there are very practical things that we can do to communicate that unconditional love. In terms of maintaining appropriate boundaries, with infants, it means we're going to establish eating and sleep patterns for them and help them to develop those eating patterns. Establishing and enforcing behavioral rules as kids are moving into toddlerhood. 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, no, you can't flush your little brother's head in the toilet, okay? No, you can't punch people or bite people. We have these rules and boundaries in relationships. And we start allowing some freedom and autonomy in kids, allowing them to have choices. As they move into childhood, we're still enforcing the rules and the behavioral rules, household rules that we have. In other words, we keep our lives predictable for our kids. We're the parents, we're still in control. They want us to be in control. It's emotionally secure for them to be in control. The same with adolescents. But we're also allowing them greater responsibility during childhood. We're allowing them to do more on their own, to develop a sense of autonomy. Because eventually, by the time they're 18 or 19, we want them to be adults. We want them to be able to be on their own. But we can't do that if we don't allow them to have gradual freedoms and responsibilities as they're able to do it. And then in adolescence, we still need to provide those limits and rules for them. Limits and rules help them to know what to do, when to do it. In adolescence, there's this desire to be on their own sometimes. And sometimes they really like having somebody tell them what to do. And there's days where it goes back and forth, and you as their parent going, I don't get it. You want to be all on your own today, but the next day you want me to do everything for you. Okay? And even sometimes when our kids are making that transition in early adulthood, they're vacillating back and forth between wanting freedom and wanting somebody to do something for them. And so we're there to provide that sense of security, that boundary. I'm still the parent, I'm still available to you. And allowing them to have greater freedoms as they get older. That's part of that boundaries contain. Lastly, the cultivating relationship activities. During infancy, being responsive, playing with kids, reading with them. In early childhood, engaging in pretend play. That's one way to hook up with preschoolers and really develop those kind of cultivating experiences. In childhood, develop a shared interest in some activity. My daughter Kylie, who's 27 right now, loves James Taylor. Why? Because as a 2- and 3-year-old, we would dance to James Taylor music. We have this shared interest in James Taylor now. We also have a shared interest in psychology. She's becoming a therapist. Okay? So we try to find something, some area with your child, and it may even be your adult kids, where you have some activity you can share together. These relationship cultivating experiences bring shared meaning to relationships. They help to bond us together. If there's laughter, laughter helps to bring emotional bonding. They found that when families or individuals or friends are laughing together, afterwards people feel closer to those individuals with whom they were laughing. So we want to have these kinds of experiences, shared activities. Planning family game nights, where we actually plan activities with our kids. In childhood, it might be a game night. It might be going to the beach. It might be going to the mountains, whatever it is. There's some activity that they enjoy doing with us. And it also means sometimes expressing interest in something they're interested in and showing interest in what they're doing. Again, something that we can share with them. Family events, vacations, activities. My youngest daughter, Nikki, and her husband just got back from Yellowstone and the Tetons. And Nikki was explaining to her husband that she participated in junior ranger programs. And he's going, what is a junior ranger program? Because he really didn't do much with his parents traveling growing up. And Nikki explained to him, every time you go to a national park, you go to the visitor center, you pick up a booklet, and you do all these activities as a family. And at the end, you get a badge, and you recite this little thing, and they make you a junior ranger. And he looked at her and said, you are a nerd. And she said, but we had fun. We had fun. We want to develop those kinds of relationship experiences with our kids. To do that, whether it's infancy, whether it's childhood, whether it's adolescence, or our adult children. You and I live in San Diego. There are no excuses for not having great relationship experiences. In the mountains, at the beach, at the zoo, at the wild animal park. There's so many things that we can do to cultivate relationships and have those kinds of relationship experiences that our kids look back and say, that was fun. I enjoyed that. And as they build those memories of those experiences, what it does is it helps to bond our families together. Now, for all of these things, what's really critical is that we're intentional. We think to ourselves, what do I need to do to demonstrate unconditional love to my kids? To maintain those boundaries, to develop those relationship cultivating experiences. We all have with us tonight something that hinders that. Can you think what it is? You're probably all sitting on it or with it right now. Our cell phones are taking away from our family experiences. Sometimes it actually helps. I love the fact some of my daughters live in different places, and it keeps us connected, and we use it like that. But too many times I've seen parents at a playground. This summer in Colorado, I watched this little girl on the playground playing all over, trying to show her mom what she was doing, and her mom was too busy on her phone. Sherry and I were out to eat not too long ago, and there was two little kids coloring, and they kept wanting to show their parents what they were doing. But their parents were buried in their cell phones. They were missing out on the experiences to to develop relationships. They needed to be intentional. In terms of repairing relationships, we need to be intentional on that unconditional love. That may involve forgiveness, giving it, and it may mean giving forgiveness and asking for forgiveness. It might be our adolescents, it might be our adult children, and going to them and saying, I blew it in some respect, something I said, something I did. We still want to maintain that boundary. If we're dealing with adults or adolescents, we don't want to lose that boundary and say, well, I'm going to go down to the level of being a friend and trying to repair this relationship. No, you're still the parent. Be the parent. It's okay to be the parent and say, I'm sorry. It's okay to be the parent and forgive. It's important for us to be the parent. And then we can engage in those relationship experiences. We may have to do it slow at first, especially with our adult kids. And we have some repairing to do. We may say, hey, would you like to go and have a coffee? Or go to a movie together? Or just go for a walk together? Just to start repairing it. Start to building those experiences that are going to bring us together. And again, what's important is that we're intentional about the whole thing. Listen to what Paul said about who we are to be as Christians. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love. He's using agape, which is unconditional love, which binds them all together in perfect unity.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Price, and we'd like to go to some of our questions. And one of the specialties of Dr. Price is really major research related to children and adoption and really the developmental portion of that. Your PhD is from Purdue University in child development.
Right.
And you've had almost how many years researching at San Diego State University?
This is starting my 30th year.
30th year.
Yep.
You look so young. So
I was 12 when I came.
You were 12. That's good.
No, sorry.
The prodigy. So that's very good. So it has great insight into actually combining biblical truths with scientific research, which he is a researcher. So there are several questions that are related to early childhood development. And this is your specialty. We have a variety of people that are here this evening and those who may be texting questions. The question relates to how much does infancy stage play into the development of a child? So the person's asking this question, how much will a child remember from infancy? So I think the question is helping us to look at that early childhood development, which is your specialty. You could probably, the next 8 hours, enlighten us on many different parts of this and beyond. Could you help us to understand that early child infancy development and how much does the parent play into this in their attachment, their health? I think that's what the question is asking.
Well, infancy is obviously setting the stage for other stages. So the quality of the relationship that we have with infants, the quality of that attachment relationship is going to set the stage for the next stage of development. Now, infancy is important, but so are the other stages. Oftentimes people will ask me, what is the most important stages in development? And I'd have to say, in my mind, there are 4. Prenatal development, infancy, adolescence, and early adulthood. I think those are the 4 most important developmental stages. And I give them all kind of equal weight. Infancy is so important because language is developing, emotions are developing, cognition is developing, and what we do during that time is really helpful in each of those kinds of areas. Now here's the good news. Most of us as parents, as long as we don't have a mental health problem, a serious mental health problem of some kind, are going to do a good job with a baby. Most of us are going to do a good job with our babies. Being responsive to them in terms of communication, in terms of holding them, establishing eating patterns, comforting them, those are the things that they really need to have. And communicating. when they want to communicate. Babies will want to communicate. They start babbling. They start cooing. When we are responsive to them, they'll do more of it. With our granddaughters, I've watched our daughter do that with our granddaughters. And it's just so fun to watch. Babies want to communicate because their brains are wired to communicate. God has wired their brains so they want to develop language. And so what we do during that first year and a half, is very important for later language, cognitive development. But most of us are going to do a good job as long as we're responsive to them. Let them follow their cues. If they want to talk to us, talk to them. If they want to play with them. If they need to lay down, let them lay down. If they're fussy, check to see if it's their diaper or they need to be fed. Those are the things that we can do as parents during that time. And what we're doing is we're trying to make the world predictable for them so that they go, oh, I do this and the big person does that. And there's these kind of schedules that I'm on. And it makes life predictable, and it makes the world feel safe. That relationship with us and that attachment with us really sets the groundwork for other relationships. Now, we have to be careful because Papa Freud made us think that if we don't do a good job in infancy, we're messed up for the rest of our lives, and you can't go back and redo it. He was wrong. Okay? We can. And it's very possible some of us might have had an insecure attachment, but later on in life we can go back and repair that. And God will do that through His Holy Spirit, but it usually has to be through a relationship. Relationship with a therapist, relationship with a spouse, relationship with a friendship, a coach, that can go back and heal that kind of lack of trust. So what we do is very important as parents. But we can, even if we did mess up, we can still go back and repair what happened during that time in development. I'm kind of going on. I'm maybe going beyond the question, but anyway.
Very good response. If you could talk to us a little bit about the other stages. Why are those the specific stages that are the most important? You named the 4.
Okay.
Could you speak to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, prenatal development, because, the most important thing, what's happening during prenatal development is all the major organs are forming. The brain is forming. It's a time we're most susceptible to environmental influences. And so that time is absolutely critical, and it seems to be in the embryonic period, in those first 3 months is really the most critical time for development. So there's so much going on in prenatal development, and there's so much susceptibility to environmental influences during that time. So that's why it's really critical. The brain's forming, all the limbs are forming, the cardiovascular system's forming. So that's why that's important. Infancy, particularly in terms of relationships, attachment, cognitive language development. Adolescence, because the most rapid changes outside of infancy and prenatal development are happening during adolescence. Rapid changes in the brain, rapid changes in physiology, hormonal changes in the system. And adolescents are trying to get used to the changes that are happening. There's changes happening to their body, to their primary, secondary sexual maturation, growth spurt, and their brain is changing at the same time they're trying to understand what their body's doing. And so now their perspective of what's going on in the world, how to interpret the world's changing along with their body. And that's an important time. That's why it's so important we as parents are there to be parents for them. We're that stability that says regardless of what changes you're going through, I'm going to be the same. That's one of the constants that makes God so reliable, is we know He's not going to change. We know He is yesterday, today, and tomorrow the same person. And when our kids have that kind of feeling like, you're my mom and dad today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Oh, that feels good. I mean, they may not say that to you. You would like them to say that to you. But they may not say that to you, but emotionally, they're feeling that. And so that's why we as parents still have a very critical role then. In early adulthood, people are making critical life decisions. And it turns out early adulthood can be one of those times that shifts people's developmental trajectories. Individuals who've experienced trauma, who've had early crises in their family, who've had really difficult times. Early adulthood can be that time that changes that life trajectory. And it seems to be several experiences that can do that. Education, going to college, entering the military. I have an older brother that going into the military changed his life for the better. religious experiences, particularly conversion experiences where people come to know Christ in early adulthood and it completely changes their lives. Entering to a career where they find meaningful work. And so what psychologists are finding, early adulthood can be that really critical time that changes a person's trajectory in life. It was for me. It was a real critical time for me, having grown up in a foster home. And all of a sudden I came in college to a professor who started believing in me and provided some parental role modeling I never had at a time that I had choices and possibilities. And early adulthood offers all kinds of choices and possibilities to people and the sense of hope that now I can change things of what happened. And so it can be a time of building resilience. And for kids who come out of good homes and have, good backgrounds, it's just a great launching pad. And early adulthood is, a time when people are starting their careers and relationships and marriage and family, etc. So that's why those 4 periods.
That's very, very helpful. And going back to early childhood development, a question here goes back to, can you traumatize an infant by allowing them to cry themselves to sleep? And it's saying, is there an age where this becomes more or less permissible? Can this hurt a relationship? So I think the basic question is, how do we allow an infant or encourage an infant to actually develop sleep patterns? And
in general, no, you're not going to traumatize a baby by allowing them to cry themselves to sleep. Here's what's important, though, is that you've checked to make sure everything's okay. That's really what's important with babies when they're crying. You're checking to make sure everything's okay. You've checked them, you've fed them, you've looked at their diaper, there's nothing there. You've burped them, and they're still fussy, they're still crying. Sometimes they just need to cry a little bit. And sometimes crying themselves to sleep is what happens with kids. And it's not necessarily traumatizing, especially if we've already checked to make sure they're okay. Where it can be potentially, I wouldn't say necessarily traumatizing, but upsetting for babies is if there's an unmet need, and that's why they're crying when they go to sleep. They're hungry. Their diaper is full. They do have gas, severe gas, or they have, acid reflux, and babies can get acid reflux, and sometimes parents aren't aware of that, and they're really hurting. Well, those kinds of things, if they go on night after night after night, and then that need isn't being met, then this idea is, well, I'm not sure my needs are going to be met. So it's important we check on them, and if we're sure that we've met all their needs, and it's time to go to bed, sometimes we may need to let them cry to go to sleep. Okay? But again, the prerequisite is that we've checked to make sure that they're okay in doing that. And then what's important with babies is trying to get them on a schedule as much as you can. It's kind of hard in those first 6 weeks, but that's a good time to try to get the nursing schedules down, the sleeping schedules, and that just helps kids develop their circadian rhythm and their sleeping patterns as well.
I know one patient asked me the question related to what you're describing is, how long is too long? Is there a time limit? So say I'm the parent asking this question about my infant that continues to cry for 10 or 15 minutes. How would you respond to that, Dr. Price?
Well, I guess if they're going 15 or 20 minutes, I'd go in and check on them again and make sure they're okay. And make sure that there isn't something in the crib or something else that's going on. If it's only 5 or 10 minutes and they're going to sleep, great. If it's going beyond that, then you need to check and see if there's something wrong. Go in there and check, and it might be, if it's an infant, picking them up, holding them, rocking them, putting them back to sleep if they need that. If it's an older child, it's just assuring them that they're going to be okay. If it's a 2 or 3-year-old and saying, no, you're fine. And sometimes what you can do is just sit in the room, not communicate with them, and not give them any kind of reinforcement for getting your attention, but just sitting in the room quietly with the lights off until they do go to sleep, and then leaving the room. So if it's going on beyond 15, 20 minutes, I'd go in and check on them, make sure that they're okay.
So you're talking a little bit about positive or negative reinforcement. Can you help us to understand that concept? And that is, as I'm parenting, say I'm coming into the room, using that as the example, and I'm trying to check on my infant, However, by coming in the room, my infant begins to cry louder.
Yeah, that especially can happen as they're getting older and they're, 8, 10, 12 months, and we barely hear them fuss and we go in and check on them. Well, now they're like, oh, I figured you out. I know how to get your attention, and all I got to do is cry a little bit. And so what we can do is we kind of unintentionally reinforce that behavior. It becomes much more problematic as kids are getting older, as they're moving into toddlerhood, in the 18 to 2 months, the 2-year range, where we put them down and they go, I need a drink, and we go in and give them a drink, and then we turn the lights off and they go, I'm afraid, and then we go in, and now we're finding we're going in 3 or 4 times, and what we're doing is we're reinforcing their behavior for staying awake, and they're going, this is working. I can stay up quite a long time with mom or dad because they keep coming in. And so it's really important we break that kind of pattern. Yeah.
And so how do we break that pattern? I mean, I remember with my own toddler, Robbins, and my daughter, the sippy cup experience where I was feeding her and I turned around, she threw the sippy cup on the floor, and of course what did I do as dad? I picked up the sippy cup, put it back on her tray there, and then I turned around again and she threw it on the ground again. And here we were, she was in control of dad, and I'm reinforcing it, for, perhaps not realizing I was doing that initially, but...
We've all fallen into that.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, if we're coming to the realization our kids are doing that, and they can do that particularly as they're getting older, moving into toddlerhood, what we need to do is stop that and say, we give them a drink of water, and that's it. Here's your drink of water, and that's it. And the lights go off. And if they're getting out of bed, it means putting them back in, but not giving them attention when we do, not talking to them. And we as parents have this tendency, we want to talk to them. It's going to be okay, da-da-da-da-da-da, and we keep da-da-da-da-da. And we keep talking. Well, that's reinforcing them to keep getting our attention. And one of the things that we can do is we simply put them down. We don't say anything to them. And if we need to, we just simply sit in a chair in the room. We don't talk to them. The lights are off. They get up. We pick them up. We put them back in bed. We don't say a word to them. We go back and sit down. And we do that. After a few nights, they get that they're not going to give me any attention. All they're doing is putting me back here in bed. I'm not getting a drink. I'm not getting talking. They're not singing to me anymore. They're just picking me up and putting me back in bed. So that helps to break that reinforcement pattern.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. There's another question that ties into a bit of this early development. And the question is, how important is a consistent discipline policy between parents and a child in creating a healthy adult relationship? So I think you talked about how you early on develop this relationship with the child, and then that grows into a relationship later as adults. But how important is for the couple to be consistent in their discipline policy? And it's asking for between two parents, which can be very challenging for most couples.
Probably the most important thing to remember about discipline that makes it work, whatever you're going to use, whether it's timeout, whether it's spanking, whether it's taking away a privilege, is being consistent. Not changing the rules. So that if they jump on the couch one time, they get spanked, the next time they jump on the couch, nothing happens. It's really important we're consistent. With adolescents, curfew. If we have a 10 o'clock, it's 10 o'clock every night, regardless of how we feel, regardless of whatever the circumstances. Next to that, it's critical that parents are consistent with each other. We have each other's back in that consistency. Sherry and I had a rule that whatever mom or dad said went. And so the girls learned that if mom said no, they came to me. My first question to them was, guess what? What did mom say? And they knew that if I said no, the first question mom would say is, what did dad say? And Sherry and I did a pretty good job of being consistent. I think so anyway. Sherry's nodding yes, that's good. Is they knew there was this consistent unity between us in the parental role and in discipline. That it was a united front. It was us versus them. And it's really important that they learn that. And it brings a sense of security. And it keeps kids from manipulating parents. Because if they start to find out that if I go to mom and she'll let me do it because dad will say no, guess where they're going to start going? And it creates tension between parents, and it creates tension between parents and kids that undermines relationships and undermines them in the long term, in the long run. That consistency in discipline and discipline between parents helps to maintain those boundaries we talk about. So that as kids look back, and our daughters look back, they know, you know what, you guys were consistent with us. We knew our household was predictable, and it was safe. And that's the thing we need to remember with kids. That predictability, that consistency, emotionally is interpreted as safety. They may not be able to articulate that, but emotionally what they feel is this. Okay, curfew's always the same. The rules are always the same about sitting at the table, putting our dishes away. The rules are always the same about talking respectfully to my parents. Emotionally, it's a relief.
It's very helpful. I've actually quoted you often and tried to give you credit for your words of the idea of being predictable, that predictability. What happens for the couple that is not able to be predictable in areas because one person believes it should be a different way than the other? Or they find themselves, when they ask the question, well, what did mom say? And mom said something different than dad wishes mom would have said that. How would you advise a couple in that situation?
Well, I think the first step is they need to talk. They need to have, the one parent needs to say to the other, we need to talk. We need to talk now. And they have, on their own, without the kids being present, this is kind of conversation that doesn't happen with the kids being present, is the parents sit down and say, listen, we have to come up with an agreeable set of rules. And whatever it is, where there is disagreement, is we got to come up with something that's consistent with our kids. And we can't move forward until we do. I mean, that's how important it is. It really is critical that parents have that kind of consistency. And if they can't move past that, then they need to come see you.
Okay, very good.
and I'm in all seriousness, folks, that is absolutely critical that our kids have that united front and that we're able to work through that. And if a couple's not able to work through that, then they may need some help in getting on the same page. Because our kids need us to be on the same page as parents. They really do. It helps them, it helps our relationship with them, and it helps our relationship with our spouse.
So if we could pause on that for just a moment, because it's such a critical piece that I see in my practice and with people I'm privileged to work with, is that piece, say the parents are trying to be on the same page. They're trying to work together, but say the daughter comes to dad and asks, and then I ask, well, what did your mom say? And then he said, well, mom said this, and really? Okay. Or I just have a bit of a emotion or anxiety, and that's seen by the child. That can simply bifurcate or split the child between the parents, which creates high levels, high doses of anxiety. Could we speak about that? Because you actually led us into that concept that it's very, very important that the child see this executive system, the couple, together and predictable, as you mentioned. Do you mind talking about that for just a moment of what happens to the child when there's a level of dissonance or disagreement between the parents? There's some arduous work to be done between the parents if they're not in agreement with parenting. And really, God invited us to have two sets of eyes. So there should be, may I say this, disagreements between the parents about parenting so that they can come to an agreement about that.
That's right. And what can happen is that the child will start to avoid that parent that they know is going to say no. They're going to start to avoid the parent who has all the rules. And that's going to create tension between the child and that parent. And that can lead to that sense of anxiety.
Yes.
Is that there's this tension between us. Because I know they're the rule follower. They're the ones that laying down the rules, and I'm not going to go to them to ask. Now we have this tension in that relationship that's going to affect all other aspects of that relationship, because now they're avoiding them to some extent, and it may cause a sense of anxiety. I'd like to be close to Dad, but I can't because he's always saying no. He's the one that's always laying down the rules. And I can't have that degree of closeness anymore. I can with Mom, but not with Dad, or vice versa. So, yeah.
So let's talk about that for just a moment, because that's in the area of Dr. John Bowlby and other specialists and yourself, helping us with, say, insecure or anxiety attachment. So at that point, the child cannot develop a healthy attachment or connection or bonding with the father in this case. Does that lead the child to some level of manipulation? So manipulating between the executive system, where the executive system is the parent role. And so now I can't go to Dad, but I can go to Mom, but I'd like to have a relationship with Dad, but I can't because he's the rule follower, as you said. What does that do to the child as they grow up?
Well, it undermines the relationship with Father.
Yes.
And so it makes it more challenging to have that kind of relationship, and they may really want that relationship. And as you said, it can lead to manipulation. It can lead to manipulation of Mom, because now I know Mom's the person who's always going to give in. Mom's going to let me spend however much I want to, or stay out as late as I want to. The other thing that can happen is that because of that, it can create tension between the husband and spouse. The husband and wife, and create conflict, which we know from the research can lead to anxiety and depression in kids. When their parents are arguing and fighting, that leads to a sense of anxiety, and even can lead to depression because of the conflict that's going on at home. So there's all kinds of negative kinds of consequences from that kind of imbalance in the relationship between the child and each of those parents. That's why it's so important that parents, when they see that happening, and most parents they're aware of that. They may ignore it, but they really can kind of get a sense that, yeah, this is happening, is they nip that in the bud. If they can't do it on their own, then it's really important they get the help they need to develop that kind of unity in their relationship. It's not only good for them, it's good for their kids in the long run. Yeah, and it's going to break a generational parenting pattern. What we don't want is our kids to develop that kind of relationship with their kids. And so that's why it's so important to correct those things when we see things going wrong, is going, oh man, we got to work on this. And then the parent who might be, the rule follower, and is to go to the other one and say, we got to work on this. Or the one who's maybe a little lenient is going, we got to change things here. Because I notice she's always coming to me. She's not going to you anymore. We got to take care of this. This is not something we want to let slide, because it's going to affect our relationship with her and our relationship with each other at some point.
Just one more question on this idea. When a child begins to manipulate, and this happens quite frequently in families, when a child is manipulating the parents, like we were talking about, what is happening to the psychic of the person? This young, could be an adolescent, could be a young adult, could be earlier, but let's say as an adolescent, when the child begins to do that, what internally happens to that child if they're moving into strong manipulation?
Well, it can create a sense of anxiety in their relationship with each of the people, or each of the people that they're involved in, the one they're trying to manipulate. And in a sense, they're manipulating both parents. I'm not going to go to you, but I'm going to go over here and go to you, because I can talk to you, but I'm going to avoid you. And that, in a sense, is a kind of manipulating, because I can control you by avoiding you. and I'm only going to go to you, so I'm not going to tell you what's going on in my life. And that can create anxiety just in terms of tension in the relationship. But it's also developing kind of a relationship approach to life that they might then take into new relationships with their peers, with a boyfriend or girlfriend, and later a spouse. And it can become a relationship pattern if it's exercised enough.
Could become a bullying pattern.
Yes.
So if I kind of manipulate or bully,
Yes.
And maybe I can camouflage it, and I'm bullying that I'll get my way, so it becomes very egocentric in nature then, rather than outward connecting with other people.
Absolutely. It can be very self-centered. Yeah.
Very self-centered.
Very narcissistic.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a question that is commonly asked, Dr. Price, and I know that in our society that it's a great question that's right here in front of me. It's one of you is asking this question, and it relates to how to discipline, because you talked about time out or time in or spanking or so forth, to provide kind of self-regulation of the child self-regulating and not overreacting to things but responding. So the question is, how can we be allowed to discipline our child with spanking when today's world it's considered child abuse? Now, I'm not sure it's considered child abuse, but if we can, this is the question that's being asked. What are your thoughts about spanking? I know you've been asked this hundreds of times, if not thousands, but what do we do with this idea of spanking or time out or time in, withdrawal with the child like you've mentioned?
Well, spanking is a form of discipline. And there's lots of different forms of discipline. Sherry and I talk about all of them in our class and how to use them. How to use timeout, you can use it right, you can use it in the wrong way. Same with privilege removal. Spanking can be used in an appropriate way. I tend to agree with James Dobson. It needs to be done with kids who are younger than age 8. I think it needs to be done with your hand as opposed to an object. I think it is sometimes we as Christians think the whole world thinks that it's child abuse. Not everybody does. Not all psychologists don't. Diana Baumrind, who's a researcher at Stanford or Berkeley, says we need to be careful about labeling spanking as a form of abuse, because what it then does is it undermines real abuse that goes on. And the folks that I know at child welfare, and I've worked with people in child welfare for 18 years, there's a tendency not to see spanking as child abuse. I mean, for most of the social workers that I know. So we need to be careful that we don't kind of create a paper tiger out there when we're thinking about this. And I think that we as parents, if we do it responsibly, we do it in a way that's appropriate, age appropriate with spanking, we can do it. You don't need to hit them 12 times. Spanking is just 1 or 2 swats to the rear, and that usually takes care of it. But spanking is just one form of discipline. And I think it's good for parents to know multiple forms of discipline depending on the circumstances and what's appropriate. For some things, timeout's appropriate because it's easy to use, and it works if you're consistent. Sometimes privilege removal is what needs to be done rather than spanking. It's far more effective. If an adolescent is misusing their phone in some way, their digital device, the best thing to do is take it away. Same with a child, as opposed to spanking. And so the more forms of discipline that we know, the more flexibility we have as parents. What's important, as I said before, is that we're consistent with our rules. We're consistent with our rules. We're consistent with consequences with our kids. That's more important than what form of discipline we're going to use. Okay. If parents are going to use spanking, then I'd say, use your hand, use it on the buttocks, and don't do it when you're angry. If you're angry, use something else. Okay? Because that's when we can, sometimes as parents we get angry and we can hit harder than what we think. So those would be the parameters that I'd say about that. And use whatever form of discipline seems to be working with your kids.
Thank you. There's someone asking a very different question here. These are a lot of good questions. I have a couple now that have sent, a couple of people have sent some text questions to me. This one is from the audience here. I recognize that I often am thinking about other things when I'm with my children. How can I be more present with them? So it's really the question, I'm not able to really focus or be present with my children. What might be some steps that you would suggest for this parent, it sounds like?
What I'd suggest is planning activities, is think about what you're going to do with your kids. Sometimes we just kind of go through life and we're not really thinking about what we're doing with our kids. We just kind of let things happen. Is to be more planful. Is to say, okay, I have this half hour. What am I going to do with my kids? Well, let's think about what we can do together. And actually think of an activity and then doing that activity. That helps to keep us focused and it helps to keep them focused. It might be doing a craft together. It may even be watching a half-hour TV show together. And then talking about it afterwards or during the show. It could be playing together. And so if we're finding our minds are drifting, probably what's happening is we're not being very planful about what we're doing when we're with them. And so I'd say the thing that will help is to say, okay, I have this half-hour time with my 4 or 5-year-old, 8, 9-year-old. What am I going to do? Let me even make a list of things that we can do together. And so when we have that time, I can go down that list and go, oh, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. Or to my 9-year-old, hey, here's some things we could do. What would you like to do? And then we do it together. And then if you actually have a task that you're doing, whether it's playing, putting something together, working on homework, you're going to be more focused. It's going to help you focus your attention.
Okay. Thank you. Someone has asked, is there a book you would recommend as we were talking about early adulthood development? The question is there a book you would recommend for relationship building into early adulthood?
Boy, I can't, not off the top of my head, there isn't. Yeah. Sherry's don't know either. Yeah, Sherry, you and I actually talked about doing a book about early adulthood once, but not that I can think of. I'm sorry. I think it's a neglected area, actually. There's a lot of parenting books on children and adolescents, but I can't think of any. There's probably something out there,
and there's not one coming to my mind either.
So I'm sorry, folks.
That's right. Let's go back to another question that's texted to me. That what if parents fight in front of their child? If they come back together or reassure, so they have a fight, they come back and they reassure the child, is that enough? Or will this break down our future relationship with our child? So I think the question is being asked that if there's the parents fighting in front of the child, number one, what do we do with that? But if they come back together and they're reassuring the child, is that going to be enough, or should there be some steps in working with the child?
Well, first of all parents are going to have conflicts in front of their kids. Those are just going to happen from time to time. It's best that we can deal with serious issues away from our kids and on our own. We can deal with them as adults and talk honestly with each other as opposed to in front of our kids. But from time to things, we're going to slip. We say something, what do you mean by that? Da-da-da-da-da. Here's the thing. As long as our kids see other good things in our relationship, and they see that we love each other and care for each other, and that the majority of the time we as parents are acting in a loving, caring relationship with each other, they're going to be okay. Because here's what happens is they see that we do get into conflict, and then we're okay. And then we move on with life, and they go, oh, but mom and dad are still loving each other. And they're still laughing with each other, and they're still having fun together. Well, and then they have this little spat. But now they're laughing again. And now they're playing with us. What that shows them is that, yeah, relationships can have conflicts, but it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And so I don't think necessarily every time that a parent has a conflict in front of kids that they necessarily have to say anything to their kids to say, oh, but mom and daddy are okay. They'll see whether you're okay or not. Your general relationship, your relationship overall, the big picture is what they're going to see. And if the big picture says mom and dad love each other, they care for each other, most of the time when they interact, it's good. Then occasionally when we have these conflicts in front of them, they're like, wonder how they're going to handle that. Oh, look at that. Now they're hugging each other. Okay, well, that's what one does when you have a conflict. And so to a sense, we're modeling to our kids what to do. Now, sometimes we may need to say, we got pretty heated, and I want you to let you know we're okay. We worked it out. And you may need to do that occasionally.
And maybe even ask the child, depending upon the age, how did that impact you?
Yeah. Were you afraid? Yeah.
Were you afraid?
Yeah.
What kind of feelings did you experience,
Yes.
like sadness, fear?
Absolutely.
These types of feelings, which would be
Yep.
helpful. But it's great because I think you're talking about, Dr. Price, you're talking about how we process. In other words, instead of just the content, what was said, it's the process. What's happening between mom and dad? Well,
Yeah.
mom and dad may have made a mistake or became reactive. However, they are going to actually take a step toward each other
Yep.
in loving ways, even following that, rather than isolating or
Yep.
walking away. Even if you walk away, come back and help the child.
That's right.
Sometimes early on in development, parents don't realize that children pick up more emotion that's going on than the parents realize.
That's right. Yeah. They can, yes. Parents may be angry with each other, not say anything to each other, but the kids pick up on the fact, oh, they're not talking to each other. And I get that look. I mean, I can see what's going on between them by the look that they give to each other. But how the momentary interactions we have with each other, whether they're positive or negative, are always interpreted within the larger context of our general relationship.
Yes.
And that's why that broader relationship issue is important. Is what's the general quality of our marriage relationship? And then within that context, kids will then interpret a conflict. If the general quality of the relationship is good and positive and loving and caring, then when we have these occasional conflicts, they go, oh, mom and dad still love each other, even because we know what their relationship's like. But if that relationship tends to be hostile and negative, and they have conflicts, well, it's like, well, that just validates kind of what I know about their relationship. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Joe Price. I really appreciate you being here this evening. And we're just about out of time this evening. We end right at 8 p.m. We have 3 minutes until then. And would you join me in thanking Dr. Joe Price as our presenter this evening?
Thank you. Enjoyed being with you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Joe. Well, we really appreciate you being here this evening, and we do have upcoming My Therapist Says presentations that we hope that you'll take time to join. The next one that will be presented is Redeemed Sexuality, A Guide to Sexuality for Singles and Campus Students by Dr. Jennifer Conzen, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California, as well as a certified sex therapist. So that should be a delightful, helpful presentation at our next My Therapist Says. We will have a word of prayer, and then we will dismiss for the evening. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the privilege to be together here and to talk about very important topics, and then to have a specialist like Dr. Joe Price, 30 years of research and teaching at the university and helping hundreds of families and individuals as well. And we just pray your blessing upon what was discussed this evening. Would you guide in all of our life relationships? And as we focused on the questions that were presented this evening for the latter part of this time, this day, we thank you that you're going to guide us as we leave here. Thank you so much for your presence in each of our lives. And we give you praise this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you again for coming to My Therapist Says. Have a great, great evening.